At dawn on December 22, 1944, the snow around Bastogne was stained black with smoke and frozen blood. The battle should have been over. Instead, it was about to become legend. At 0530 hours, Oberst Karl Brenner pressed himself deeper into a frozen foxhole less than 300 meters from the American lines outside Bastogne, Belgium. Ice coated his gloves. His breath hung in the air like smoke as he studied the distant tree line through binoculars. Brenner was 45 years old. A veteran of the Eastern Front. Hardened by sieges, retreats, and winter warfare. He now commanded the 15th Volksgrenadier Division, and according to every rule of war, the battle in front of him should have ended days ago. His division had sealed the American perimeter on December 20th. The enemy was surrounded. No supply routes. No reinforcements. No way out. Brenner had nearly 8,000 men, backed by armor, artillery, and direct orders from higher command, take Bastogne immediately. The crossroads town was the keystone of the entire German Ardennes offensive. Lose Bastogne, and the offensive would stall. Take it, and the road to Antwerp would reopen. Inside the frozen ring were American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division, roughly 18,000 men, most of them light infantry. They had arrived in rushed truck convoys on December 19, thrown into position without proper winter gear, short on ammunition, and carrying almost no heavy weapons. Many still wore summer uniforms. Temperatures dropped well below freezing at night. The 101st had no tanks. Their artillery was limited. Standard military doctrine predicted that surrounded airborne infantry facing armor would collapse within 48 hours. Yet they did not. From the first day, conditions inside the perimeter were brutal. Food supplies were never meant to last a siege. By December 21, rations were slashed. Some units survived on one meal a day. Men scavenged abandoned Belgian homes and farms. They slaughtered livestock when they found it. Hunger became a constant companion. Medical conditions were even worse. The main division clearing station had been overrun on December 19, captured along with most trained medical staff and supplies. Wounded soldiers were treated in cellars, barns, and shattered houses. Surgeons operated with improvised tools, often without proper anesthesia. Bandages were washed and reused. Men died from wounds that should have been survivable. Ammunition was counted round by round. Machine gunners were ordered to fire only at confirmed targets. Riflemen were told to make every shot matter. By December 22, American artillery units were limited to 10 rounds per gun per day, barely enough to hold a defensive line. No harassment fire. No waste. Every shell was a decision. Among the units defending Bastogne was the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, an all-black American unit operating massive 155 mm howitzers, fighting the same cold, hunger, and isolation as everyone else and about to play a role history would almost forget. The 969th Field Artillery Battalion had been attached to the 101st Airborne for one specific reason, to provide the heavy firepower the Airborne Division simply did not possess on its own. Their massive 155 mm guns were among the few weapons inside the perimeter capable of countering German artillery and breaking up armored assaults. Throughout the siege, the battalion performed with exceptional discipline. Despite crippling ammunition shortages, the gunners fired thousands of rounds in direct support of the infantry holding the line. Every shell was logged. Every mission was weighed against the reality that there would be no ground resupply. What the defenders had on hand would have to last until relief arrived, or until the perimeter collapsed. The enemy was not only German. The cold was relentless. Each night, temperatures dropped well below freezing. Soldiers crouched in shallow foxholes as the frozen ground leached heat from their bodies. Frostbite and trench foot spread quickly. Some men lost toes. Others lost fingers. Many never fully recovered. To survive, paratroopers improvised. They pressed newspapers and rags into their uniforms for insulation. They wrapped their feet in burlap sacks. Men crowded together in holes barely large enough for one, sharing warmth like animals in winter. The cold drained strength. It slowed reactions. It made every movement painful. And yet, morale did not break. The men of the 101st believed they would be relieved. They believed Patton was coming. They believed the siege would end before ammunition or food ran out. That belief mattered. It carried them through conditions that would have shattered less confident formations. This was now the third day of encirclement. The Americans were still fighting. From his forward positions, Oberst Karl Brenner watched in disbelief. He had seen surrounded units before. On the Eastern Front, encircled Soviet formations either attempted immediate breakouts or collapsed within 48 hours once reality set in. Isolation destroyed cohesion. Officers lost control. Men abandoned positions searching for food, warmth, or shelter. Once soldiers accepted that capture or death was inevitable, the will to fight usually vanished. But these American paratroopers did not behave that way. Brenner could not understand why. His division had launched repeated assaults over 3 days. Each time, German infantry advanced expecting the American line to crumble. Each time, they encountered resistance that should not have existed. Machine gun nests that should have been neutralized continued firing. Foxholes that should have been abandoned were still manned. American soldiers who should have been exhausted and demoralized fought as if they expected to win. The casualty figures were baffling. Brenner's battalions were suffering losses typical of attacks against well-prepared fortified defenses, not the collapse of a surrounded enemy. Regimental commanders reported that American fire discipline was precise, ammunition usage tightly controlled, and defensive positions carefully maintained. These were not the signs of a desperate force awaiting destruction. Something about these paratroopers was fundamentally different from anything Brenner had faced in 5 years of war. The problem was not terrain. Bastogne sat amid rolling farmland with clear fields of fire. The town itself was small, defensible, but not naturally strong. The Americans held roughly 16 square kilometers, a thin defensive ring around a critical road junction. German artillery could range every position. Attacks could come from all directions at once. The problem was not American equipment. German intelligence officers inspected abandoned foxholes and captured supplies. The paratroopers carried M1 Garand rifles, a handful of Browning machine guns, several bazookas, and limited mortars. Standard American infantry weapons. Capable, but nothing extraordinary. True, the Americans had attached armor and artillery units, but not in numbers sufficient to explain their success. The problem was not manpower. Brenner's staff estimated the defenders at no more than 18,000 men. His division alone fielded around 8,000, and multiple additional German divisions were attacking other sectors of the perimeter. Taken together, German forces enjoyed nearly 5-to-1 superiority, along with overwhelming advantages in tanks and artillery. And yet, the assaults kept failing. The first major attack had come on December 20th at 1,400 hours. Brenner committed 2 battalions against the eastern perimeter near the village of Bizery. The plan was textbook: coordinated infantry advance, artillery preparation, rapid penetration, and collapse of the line. On paper, the Americans should have folded. They did not. The assault plan was straightforward: a concentrated artillery preparation followed by an infantry advance supported by assault guns. American positions would be crushed under fire, German troops would close the distance, and the defensive line would collapse. At least, that was the theory. From his command post, Oberst Karl Brenner watched through binoculars as the artillery program unfolded exactly on schedule. Shells walked methodically across the American perimeter. Foxholes disappeared under exploding earth. Trees snapped and shattered. Columns of dirt and snow rose into the frozen air. The bombardment lasted 15 minutes, more than sufficient, by every accepted standard, to neutralize lightly dug-in infantry. Then Brenner ordered the advance. German infantry moved forward across 300 meters of open ground. The distance closed steadily. 200 meters. 150. Then the Americans opened fire. The volume and coordination of fire were impossible to reconcile with the effects of the barrage. Machine guns erupted from multiple positions along the line. Rifle fire was measured, controlled, and lethal. Mortar rounds fell with precision among the advancing formations. Men dropped instantly. The leading elements went to ground. The momentum stalled. Brenner committed his second wave. Fresh troops pushed through the pinned-down first wave and resumed the advance. They reached within 100 meters of the American foxholes. The fire intensified. Officers fell. Squad leaders were hit. Command dissolved into chaos. No one could cross the final stretch of open ground. By 1600 hours, Brenner ordered a withdrawal. The attack had failed. Casualty reports arrived soon after. 180 men lost, killed or wounded, in a single afternoon. The American line remained intact. More troubling were the after-action reports. German officers confirmed that American defensive fire never slackened, even during the artillery bombardment. The paratroopers had remained in their foxholes throughout the shelling and resumed full defensive fire the moment German infantry appeared. This behavior was abnormal. Brenner had seen countless units collapse under artillery fire. Even experienced soldiers abandoned positions, sought deeper cover, or required time to reorganize after a bombardment. But the Americans at Bastogne appeared unaffected. They absorbed the shelling and fought back immediately, as if nothing had happened. By the evening of December 21st, Brenner received new orders from Corps headquarters. He was to demand the American surrender. The Corps commander believed the situation was self-evident. Surrounded forces always surrendered once the reality of isolation became clear. The Americans had no supplies, no reinforcements, and no escape. Reason, it was assumed, would prevail. On the morning of December 22, German officers approached the American lines under a flag of truce and delivered the surrender ultimatum. It was formal and detailed. It stated that American forces were completely encircled, that further resistance was pointless, that continued fighting would lead to total destruction, and that honorable surrender terms were available. The response arrived within the hour. It consisted of a single word. Nuts. Brenner stared at the message in disbelief. He did not understand the slang, but his English-speaking intelligence officer explained it clearly. The American commander was not merely refusing to surrender. He was ridiculing the demand. This was unprecedented. Brenner had issued and received surrender ultimatums throughout the war. Surrounded commanders sometimes refused, citing expected relief or plans for breakout. They answered formally. They explained their position. This response was different. It was contempt. The Americans were freezing, low on ammunition, surrounded, outnumbered, and under constant attack, and they were laughing. Only then did Brenner begin to grasp the nature of the enemy he faced. The 101st Airborne was elite, not because of weapons or numbers, but because of mindset. These soldiers did not merely hope to win. They believed victory was inevitable. Not desperate resistance. Not fatalism. Conviction. Soldiers who believe they will die fight fiercely but often break once losses mount. Soldiers who expect capture eventually surrender to preserve their lives. But soldiers who believe they will win fight differently. They take calculated risks. They counterattack. They hold positions others would abandon. They do not recognize impossibility. The paratroopers at Bastogne believed the German forces surrounding them were already defeated. All that remained was to endure until relief arrived, or until the Germans gave up. That belief made them extraordinarily dangerous. Every German unit attacking the perimeter reported the same observations. American positions were never abandoned without orders. Wounded men continued firing from foxholes. Officers remained with their troops instead of directing from the rear. Every defensive position had to be taken by direct assault, because the Americans refused to yield ground under pressure. The psychological impact on German troops was profound. Soldiers advancing toward Bastogne knew they were facing an enemy that would not quit. That knowledge bred hesitation. It encouraged caution. It slowed attacks. Brenner's regimental commanders warned their battalions that fighting at Bastogne was unlike any previous operation. The Americans were professional soldiers who would die in place rather than retreat. That reputation spread quickly through the German divisions. Units preparing for assault were told the same thing. They were attacking elite American paratroopers, troops who had never been beaten, and who did not believe defeat was possible. Stories began circulating through German units about the Americans inside Bastogne. Stories of paratroopers continuing to hold isolated foxholes after the rest of their squads had been wiped out, still firing until their ammunition was gone. Stories of wounded Americans refusing evacuation so they could remain with their units. Stories of defensive positions overrun during night attacks, only to be retaken by American counterattacks at first light. Some of these accounts were exaggerated, as such stories often are. But enough were confirmed to be true that German soldiers began to regard the 101st Airborne with a level of respect and fear reserved for very few Allied formations. German intelligence officers attempted to identify what made these Americans different. They examined captured equipment and found nothing unusual. American weapons were standard issue. Nothing technologically superior. Prisoners revealed that many of the paratroopers were young men, some fighting their first major battle. There was no secret weapon. No hidden advantage in firepower. The difference was psychological. The Americans believed they would hold Bastogne. That confidence was not blind optimism. It was rooted in training, reinforced by trust and leadership, and strengthened by absolute faith in the men beside them. Every soldier in every foxhole believed the line would hold, because everyone else believed it would. That shared certainty created a defensive system that could not be broken by conventional assault. On December 23, the weather changed. For the first time in 4 days, the fog lifted. When the clouds broke, any remaining hope Oberst Karl Brenner had of capturing Bastogne vanished. The fog had been both ally and enemy to the defenders. It concealed German troop movements and grounded American aircraft. But it also limited German observation and reduced the effectiveness of artillery fire. The Americans had adapted to fighting in low visibility better than the Germans expected. When the sky cleared on the 23rd, the transformation was immediate. Gray skies gave way to brilliant blue. Visibility stretched for kilometers. American forward observers could finally see German positions clearly. Artillery fire grew more accurate, but more importantly, air power returned. At approximately 1,000 hours, transport aircraft appeared over Bastogne. Wave after wave of C-47s dropped supply bundles by parachute directly into the perimeter. In total, 241 aircraft delivered more than 140 tons of supplies in 1,446 bundles. Despite German anti-aircraft fire, the drops were remarkably precise. Nearly 95% of the supplies were recovered by American forces. The cargo included ammunition, food, medical equipment, and winter supplies. Even more decisive was what followed. American fighter bombers filled the sky and began striking German positions. Artillery batteries, armored concentrations, and supply columns were attacked relentlessly. The Germans had virtually no air cover. The Luftwaffe was largely absent from the Ardennes. American aircraft dominated the air completely. Brenner's logistical situation deteriorated almost immediately. Ammunition stocks were already low after days of constant fighting. Fuel reserves were critically short. Casualty clearing stations overflowed with wounded. Now, American aircraft were destroying trucks attempting to bring supplies forward. Any vehicle that moved in daylight became a target. Supply convoys were forced to operate at night, slowing resupply to a crawl. Inside Bastogne, the situation reversed. American ammunition stocks were replenished. Medical care improved dramatically. Defensive positions could be repaired and reinforced. The siege was no longer being held together by endurance alone. It was being sustained by air power the Germans could not counter. The 101st Airborne was no longer trapped. They could be supplied indefinitely, while German forces surrounding them steadily ran short of fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements. On December 24, Brenner received alarming intelligence. American armored forces were advancing from the south. General George Patton's Third Army was driving toward Bastogne. Lead elements were less than 10 kilometers away, fighting through German blocking positions. Brenner understood the implication immediately. If American armor reached Bastogne, his division would be caught between the paratroopers inside the perimeter and armored forces attacking from outside. His division would be destroyed. The hunters would become the hunted. Brenner requested authorization to withdraw while withdrawal was still possible. Corps headquarters refused. Hitler had personally ordered Bastogne taken. The directive was absolute. The attack would continue, regardless of cost. On December 25, Christmas Day, German commanders launched a final coordinated assault, the largest and most desperate of the siege. At 0300 hours, 18 Panzer IV tanks, carrying infantry from the 115th Panzer Grenadier Regiment of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, advanced between the villages of Flamierge and Givry. Their objective was the northwestern perimeter near Champs and Hemrol, an approach the Germans believed to be less heavily defended. The assault began in darkness. Tanks advanced in tight formation, infantry riding on the hulls and following close behind. The temperature was far below freezing. The ground was frozen solid, hard as concrete. Visibility was limited to barely 50 meters in the pre-dawn darkness. German commanders hoped to achieve surprise and breakthrough before the defenders could react. They were mistaken. The Americans were waiting. Daylight reconnaissance on December 24 had identified the likely approach routes. Artillery from the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment and attached units had already registered their guns. Defensive positions were reinforced. Additional bazooka teams and anti-tank guns were moved into place. The Americans knew an attack was coming. They simply did not know exactly when. As the German columns pushed forward through the darkness, American forward observers picked up the unmistakable rumble of tank engines. The sound carried clearly across the frozen ground. Within moments, artillery fire was requested. The response was immediate. Shells began falling directly onto the advancing Germans. These were not standard high-explosive rounds. They were fitted with proximity fuses, detonating above the ground and bursting into clouds of steel fragments that rained downward across the open fields. The effect was catastrophic. German infantry riding on the tanks were struck instantly. Men were thrown from the hulls, torn apart by shrapnel. Others collapsed where they stood. The infantry following behind attempted to scatter, but there was nowhere to hide. Entire groups went down at once. The column hesitated, but it did not stop. Stopping meant death. The tanks pressed forward through the barrage, engines roaring as commanders sealed their hatches and drove blind through fire and smoke. They aimed to reach the American line before artillery could completely dismantle the attack. At approximately 300 meters, American anti-tank weapons opened fire. Tank destroyers concealed in hull-down positions fired almost simultaneously with towed anti-tank guns. The night erupted in flashes of light. The 1st Panzer IV vanished in a sudden explosion, flames tearing through the hull as its ammunition detonated. A second tank took a direct hit to the turret and ground to a halt, smoke pouring from shattered hatches. A third lost its tracks and slewed sideways, blocking the path of vehicles behind it. The surviving tanks accelerated, spreading out to avoid presenting clustered targets. German gunners fired blindly toward muzzle flashes, hoping to silence the American guns. The infantry could no longer keep pace. Pinned down by artillery fire, wounded, or already dead, the foot soldiers were left behind. The tanks continued forward alone. Several Panzer IVs breached the forward American defenses, pushing past initial foxholes and driving into the battalion command area near Hemrol. For a brief moment, the outcome hung in the balance. American positions were overrun. German infantry who had survived the barrage entered the village behind the tanks. Fighting erupted at close range, confused, violent, and chaotic. Then the Americans counterattacked. Officers formed small assault teams armed with bazookas. Sergeants rallied scattered men and drove them forward through the smoke and confusion. American paratroopers engaged the tanks at point-blank range, sometimes from less than 20 meters. They aimed for tracks, engine compartments, and rear armor, the weak points. Bazooka teams worked in pairs, one firing while the other reloaded. Infantry cleared buildings and streets using grenades, rifles, and bare hands. The fighting was savage. Men killed each other at distances measured in steps. No mercy was expected. None was given. The Americans fought with calm certainty. The Germans fought with growing desperation. The battle continued through the early morning hours. One by one, German tanks were destroyed or disabled. Some crews abandoned their vehicles and attempted to escape on foot through the darkness. American machine guns cut them down before they reached safety. German infantry trying to consolidate gains found themselves isolated and surrounded. Small groups were eliminated or forced to surrender. By 0700 hours, as dawn broke over the frozen fields, the fighting ended. All 18 German tanks lay burning or crippled around Hemrol and Champs. Wrecked hulls marked the failed advance like a line of funeral pyres. The infantry attack had collapsed completely. German forces withdrew, leaving hundreds of casualties behind. The Americans not only held their ground, they had pushed their line forward in several areas during the counterattack. The Christmas Day assault was the final major German attempt to seize Bastogne by direct force. 6 days of attacks had achieved nothing. Thousands of German troops and dozens of tanks had been committed. The cost was enormous. The result was failure. On December 26, at approximately 1645 hours, the siege was finally broken. Lead elements of the 4th Armored Division, advancing from the south as part of Patton's Third Army, reached the outskirts of Bastogne. The first vehicle to break through was an M4A3E2 Sherman Jumbo, call sign Cobra King, commanded by First Lieutenant Charles Boggess. The crew had fought through multiple German defensive lines to reach the town. The relief operation had cost the 4th Armored Division nearly 1,000 casualties in 5 days of continuous combat. The breakthrough came through the village of Assenois, south of Bastogne. German forces had heavily fortified the approach, determined to prevent the link-up. American armor and infantry fought house to house. Tank destroyers knocked out anti-tank guns. Infantry cleared positions with grenades and rifle fire. The advance was slow. It was costly. It was unstoppable. When Boggess Sherman reached the American perimeter, paratroopers from the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion emerged to meet it. The engineers had fought as infantry throughout the siege. They waved. They cheered. Boggess leaned out of the turret and asked a simple question. "Where's headquarters?" The engineers waved the tank forward and guided it deeper into the town. The arrival of American armor did not end the fighting. German forces immediately began attacking the narrow corridor Patton's troops had opened, attempting to sever the link and restore the siege. For several more days, bitter fighting raged along the road south of Bastogne as additional American units forced their way forward and widened the passage. But the decisive moment had already passed. The instant that first tank entered Bastogne, everything changed. The paratroopers were no longer encircled. They were no longer isolated. The siege was over. That night, Oberst Karl Brenner ordered his forces to withdraw. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division had taken severe losses during the battle. Exact casualty figures were never fully recorded. By late 1944, German administrative systems were breaking down, and many unit records were lost or destroyed. What was clear was this: a division that held numerical superiority, greater firepower, and complete encirclement had been stopped cold. The 101st Airborne had held. What Brenner, and many other German commanders, did not fully understand until after the war was why the Americans fought the way they did. It was not just leadership, or training, or equipment, though all of those mattered. It was something deeper. The 101st Airborne Division was composed entirely of volunteers. Every man had chosen to become a paratrooper. Airborne training was among the most demanding programs in the American military, and it was designed specifically to eliminate anyone who might break under pressure. Men seeking comfort did not volunteer. Men afraid of heights did not volunteer. Men uncertain of their physical or mental limits did not volunteer. Training began with standard infantry instruction and then moved to jump school at Fort Benning, Georgia. The physical requirements were intentionally punishing. Candidates ran long distances carrying full combat loads. They completed endless push-ups, pull-ups, rope climbs, and obstacle courses. The training was harder than battlefield conditions demanded, by design. Instructors aimed to break anyone who could be broken. It was better to fail on a training field in Georgia than to fail in combat, where failure meant death. Many did fail. The dropout rate exceeded 30%. Some men quit. Others were injured. A small number were removed for discipline or inability to meet standards. Those who completed the program emerged transformed. They trusted themselves. They trusted the men beside them. They had been tested, and proven. They wore their silver parachutist wings with pride, but more importantly, they carried unshakable confidence. The training forged bonds no conventional infantry unit could replicate. Paratroopers jumped from aircraft together. They trusted their parachutes, their equipment, and each other with their lives. That trust carried directly into combat. When a paratrooper entered battle, he knew every man beside him had volunteered, endured the same trials, and met the same standards. The 101st Airborne Division had been activated in August 1942 and trained as a unit for more than a year before seeing combat. Battalions trained together. Companies trained together. Squads trained together. By the time they deployed to England in 1943, they were among the most cohesive formations in the American Army. Their first combat came on June 6, 1944, during the Normandy invasion. Paratroopers jumped behind German lines in darkness. Units scattered. Small groups fought independently for days, improvising, adapting, and surviving. The division learned a critical lesson: officers could fall, and the fight would continue. Sergeants stepped up. Privates took initiative. Leadership became fluid. After Normandy, the division fought across France, then returned to England to refit and retrain. In September 1944, they jumped again during Operation Market Garden, landing near Eindhoven. For 8 days, they held a narrow corridor while British armor attempted to reach Arnhem. The operation failed strategically, but the 101st completed every mission assigned to it. By December 1944, the division was resting at Camp Mourmelon when the German offensive erupted in the Ardennes. There was no time to prepare. The paratroopers were rushed forward without proper winter gear, carrying only what ammunition they could grab, trusting that supply lines would catch up. That experience defined how they fought at Bastogne. These were not inexperienced troops. They were veterans of airborne landings, hedgerow combat, and prolonged defensive operations. They understood chaos. They understood loss. They understood how to keep fighting when plans collapsed. They had already survived situations that should have destroyed them. So when Bastogne was surrounded, fear did not dominate. They trusted their training. They trusted their leaders. And above all, they trusted each other. They were not conscripts. They were not assigned unwillingly. They were men who had volunteered for the most dangerous role in the army. That selection process created a rare psychological cohesion. Every man knew the soldiers beside him had chosen this path. They knew no one had joined the Airborne with the intention of quitting. When the 101st found itself encircled, surrender was never seriously considered, not because of orders, but because it conflicted with who they believed themselves to be. Elite troops did not surrender simply because they were outnumbered. The idea was almost unthinkable. That mindset produced the defensive performance that stunned German forces. The paratroopers were not fighting desperately to survive. They were fighting calmly, to win. They believed relief would come. They believed they could hold until it arrived. They believed the Germans surrounding them were under greater strain than they were. They were right. German units that fought at Bastogne carried the memory of that battle for the rest of the war. Officers who had been there warned new troops about American paratroopers. Veterans told stories. They spoke of machine gun positions that continued firing after direct artillery hits. Of paratroopers who remained hidden in overrun foxholes, letting German infantry pass before attacking from behind. Of wounded Americans who refused capture and fought until they were killed. Those stories spread through German ranks. And they changed how the enemy viewed the men of the 101st Airborne. German soldiers carried the stories with them long after the fighting ended. They spoke of American medics who ran across open ground under machine gun fire to reach the wounded. Of officers who led counterattacks themselves instead of directing from the rear. Of sergeants who continued to defend isolated positions alone after every man in their squad had been killed or wounded. Taken together, the stories described an enemy that simply refused to break. The psychological effect was unmistakable. German infantry who had fought effectively against Soviet formations in the east or British units in the west found themselves hesitating when facing American paratroopers. They delayed attacks. They demanded heavier artillery preparation. They waited for tanks before advancing. They moved more cautiously. They took fewer risks. That hesitation mattered. It robbed German assaults of momentum and gave American defenders precious time to react. German commanders noticed the shift immediately. Units that normally attacked with aggression became restrained when facing the 101st Airborne. Officers had to push harder to maintain offensive pressure. Fear, not of American weapons, but of American soldiers, had become a factor in German tactical planning. By January 1945, the reputation followed the paratroopers beyond Bastogne. When German units encountered American airborne troops elsewhere, they assumed the same stubborn resistance. Attacks were preceded by heavier artillery fire. More resources were committed. Engagements were avoided altogether when possible. That caution granted American forces repeated tactical advantages in later battles. The psychological shock of Bastogne extended far beyond the Ardennes. Oberst Karl Brenner survived the war. He surrendered to American forces in April 1945. During post-war interrogation, intelligence officers asked him about Bastogne. He did not hesitate. He described it as the most difficult battle of his career. He stated that the 101st Airborne fought better than any formation he had faced on either the Eastern or Western Front. When asked what made them different, Brenner paused for a long time. Then he answered. He said the Americans at Bastogne fought as if they had already won, and were simply waiting for the Germans to realize it. That confidence, he explained, was more dangerous than any weapon. In later interviews with U.S. Army historians, Brenner described Bastogne as the moment he understood Germany would lose the war. Not because of American numbers. Not because of industrial output. But because of will. If the United States could field thousands of soldiers like those at Bastogne, men who volunteered for the hardest assignments and then performed under the worst imaginable conditions, Germany could not win, regardless of how many tanks or divisions it deployed. At a certain point, quality outweighed quantity. The 101st Airborne at Bastogne represented that threshold, a type of soldier that could not be overcome through tactics or numbers alone. The American commander during the siege was Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. He was the officer who authored the now famous reply to the German surrender demand. McAuliffe survived the war and remained in the army, eventually retiring as a four-star general in 1956. He was asked about Bastogne many times in the years that followed. He always deflected credit. He insisted the battle had been won by the soldiers, not by his decisions. He said commanding the 101st was easy because they were professionals who understood their mission and required little direction. The word, nuts, became legendary. The full story behind that reply revealed much about McAuliffe's leadership and the mindset of his command. When German officers delivered the surrender ultimatum on the morning of December 22, McAuliffe had been asleep in his command post. He was awakened and handed the document. He read it once. Then he laughed. Not out of bravado. Not for effect. He simply found the idea absurd. The Americans were holding. Relief was coming. And surrender was never an option. That moment captured everything Bastogne represented, not defiance for its own sake, but absolute confidence in victory. And that confidence, more than artillery, armor, or numbers, is what broke the German offensive in the Ardennes.